Every time the Democrats lose a presidential election, we hear an outcry to abolish the Electoral College. At the moment, two of the four leading candidates in the Democratic primaries, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, are calling for eliminating it. A third, Kamala Harris, is open to the idea, and Joe Biden isn't saying. Should we care? On today's Connecticut Yankee Sanity, we'll discuss the institution and speculate as to why the Democrats are not so keen on keeping it in the mix. At the time of the country's founding, democracy was a dubious concept, here and abroad. Men in power doubted that the common people were capable of choosing their leaders wisely. The founding fathers shared that view. If you ask a Democrat today, he'd say Mr. Trump is living proof that their skepticism was justified. If you ask a Republican, you'd get the same answer, but with Mrs. Clinton as the proof. The founders feared manipulation of public opinion by factions. They had other fears as well, which we'll get into in a minute. But they also believed in representative government by the consent of the governed. You see the problem. On the one hand, the people might not be well informed and educated enough to choose the right leaders to govern them. On the other, the government, if it were to be legitimate and respected, had to be one that the people had a say in electing. The Electoral College was the founders' response to the dilemma. Its members were to be men appointed solely for the purpose of electing a president and a vice president. Their duty done, they were to be dismissed. The idea was that they would be disinterested with no ties or allegiance to the candidates. Since they were dispersed among the states, influencing them as a body would be impossible. The viewer will infer correctly that the framers, for this was the time when the Constitution was being drafted and adopted, were more than a little sensitive to the dangers of election interference and corruption. The Constitution provided that it would be left up to the individual states how their electors were chosen. In practice, the Democratic Party in each state appoints its electors, and the Republican Party does likewise. Each appoints a number of electors equivalent to the number of the state's congressmen and senators. After each state's popular vote is in, the electors of the party of the candidate who won it cast their votes, which are later certified by the Congress. Although the Constitution is silent on the point, it's traditional that the states, with the exception of Maine and Nebraska, which apportion their electoral votes by district, cast all of their electoral votes for the winner of their popular vote. 99% of the time, that's the case, although in 2016, 5 electors defected from Mrs. Clinton and 2 from Mr. Trump. In some states, such faithless electors can be prosecuted, but none ever has been. The Federalist number 68, which I've read so you won't have to, was published in March of 1788 in the New York Packet, a newspaper. In it, Alexander Hamilton explains the Electoral College. The election of a president was of such critical importance that, quote, it should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation and to a judicious combination of all the reasons and inducements which were proper to govern their choice, unquote. How many of us today, I wonder, cast our votes in that manner? A small number of persons, Hamilton went on to explain, specially chosen by their fellow citizens, would be most likely to have the necessary judgment, insight, and understanding for the task. So far, so good. But there was more. The framers were fearful of tumult and disorder. Luckily for them, they all died before witnessing the aftermath of the 2016 election and what may be awaiting us in 2020. It's a tribute to their foresight, wisdom, and understanding of human nature that they anticipated the need for an intermediate stage in the electoral process as a preventative against mob rule, if the general population were incited to it, or other hostile influences. Foreign influence in particular, or what we refer to more benignly as meddling, concerned them. The Russians made an attempt at it in 2016. The Chinese will certainly join in with them in 2020. Mrs. Clinton, who as Secretary of State is under scrutiny for influence peddling to foreigners and who exploited Russian sources in the creation of the fake dossier, is now at the center of the Spygate scandal. And that confirms, again, the framers' prudence. They also feared that presidential candidates, if the popular vote alone were decisive, would concentrate their campaign efforts in the population centers to obtain the votes they needed. That would mean that the rural and less populated areas of the country would effectively be disenfranchised. Sorry to pick on her again, but ignoring her husband's advice, Mrs. Clinton concentrated her efforts on the liberal coasts and Democratic strongholds, such as her native Illinois, while Mr. Trump was all over the map, practically every day. She won the popular vote, but if it were decisive, she would have been elected on it at the expense of the 30 states that went for Mr. Trump. Bearing in mind the Democrats' commitment to a long-term strategy for gaining and expanding power, it's not a stretch to link their distaste for the Electoral College to their enthusiasm for open borders. There are, at present, 22 million illegals living in the U.S. You can be sure that if our legislators have their way, the majority of them will one day have voting rights. Just take it as a given, and don't kid yourself that any significant number of them will be deported. Open borders would facilitate the entry of even more, perhaps to the point of we ain't seen nothing yet. They tend to congregate on the coasts and in large urban centers. It's a fact that Latinos lean left. In 2008, 67% of the Latino vote went to Barack Obama, and in 2020, 71%. In 2016, 66% went to Mrs. Clinton. Get it? Now, factor in a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College, and we're set for a perfect storm of Democratic hegemony. So, in answer to the question of should we care, the answer is yes. Voting for a president and legislators who will defend the Electoral College and secure the borders secures our democracy and our way of life as well. I think that's what the Founding Fathers had in mind when they drafted the Constitution that created it and made it the law of the land. Thanks for watching. Be sure to click like and subscribe to support the channel and pass the link along. We'll see you back here next time.